Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. I am your host, Christy Haberman. I am glad you're here. Thanks for being a part of our community. A few disclaimers before we get started. I am a licensed therapist. However, this podcast is not to be considered mental health therapy or counseling. It is for entertainment purposes only and is not associated with my counseling practice, Christy Haberman Counseling Services. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Christy Haberman. So I've been looking at the path that I wanted to go with my podcast. And I realized over the last few days that the reason why I started the podcast, I said I wanted people to tell their stories. But I've been looking at people like on Instagram and other podcasts, and it's like we get towards where we feel somewhat healed from grief and we start thinking we want to help other people, we want to do this, we want to do that. And so you see all these blogs about how to heal from grief, how to do this from grief. This is what you say when this person says this and what this person says. But I think we're jumping too fast. I think we're jumping too fast into trying to help people heal and not realizing that there's other parts of grief that people, and I hate to say need to experience, but they need to go through. And I think that there's this push, even amongst the grief community, to push people into healing. And what we don't do is we don't allow them to be right where they are in that moment. And that's kind of where I am coming from my podcast. And so I was thinking, and it was an Instagram post that I saw it on there. But really what I'm trying to do with this podcast is to validate your grief. That someone cares. Someone cares about your story. Someone cares about what you went through. And I worry sometimes that people that are looking for the healing message will get on my podcast and say, oh, this is not what I wanted. I don't need to feel sad. I don't need to feel this. I need to feel better. Well, there's a problem with that. So the problem is that we have these things called emotions, and we don't like them very well. There's a movement called positive psychology, which is that you turn every negative into emotion into a positive emotion. However, there are things that we can learn about ourselves from our grief, and that is where I am kind of coming from. I have had huge growth in who I am and learning about myself and becoming more self-confident with who I am because I did this deep dive into grief. Grief and I became friends. It's like that friend of me you have at work where you have to, get along with them even though you don't like them very much. That's kind of like grief, right? Is that we don't want to be grieving. We had this huge loss. And we don't want to like that loss, but whether we like it or not, grief is here to stay. And you need to make friends with your grief. The consequences of being invalidated. So what invalidated means is you say to someone, I'm grieving today. I'm really sad today. And they say, maybe you shouldn't feel that way. Maybe go outside in nature and that'll make you feel better. Instead of saying, I'm sorry that you're feeling sad today. And I've realized that I am so used to being invalidated about my grief that I don't share. So after Kai died, I didn't tell anybody. I told my best friend, my husband, and I told my son, because they come over and interact with Kai on a regular basis, but I didn't tell anyone else. And my coworkers at work, I was getting ready to go home and I said, God, this is going to be so hard going home when Kai died. And they're like, what? You went all day without telling us that your dog died? Your like best friend? I was like, yeah, because I'm not used to people caring. And I'm not sure they cared. Like one person cared. The other person was just like, oh, your dog died. And off she went. But that's all right because I've learned to sit with my grief and make friends with my grief. So invalidation, if you are not aware, And I looked this up on the internet, and I was like, and I looked at the consequences of invalidation, and it describes me perfectly until up about 3 years ago when I learned to validate myself. So the first thing we get is problems with managing our emotions. It leads to confusion, self-doubt, and distrust. Well, of course we distrust. Everyone tells us that we're not supposed to feel this way. We're supposed to be over it. It's like, how do I trust my own experience of grief when I have society and everyone around me telling me that my grief is wrong? Like, how do we do that? That's a struggle. Issues with personal identity. I identified as a mother. I am still Christopher's mother, and I am still Colin's mother. But right after Christopher died, I had an identity crisis. Who am I? And then I had an identity crisis because I'm a therapist. I am supposed to handle this grief. I am supposed to know what to do. And then it goes back to nobody told me it would be like this. All this education, all of this experience in counseling, and no one told me that it had been like this. Before I lost Christopher, I'd had one grieving client. I don't remember her name. I don't remember. But what I do remember her, when I was counseling her, she'd give me these looks. And I recognize them looks now. Just like when we are watching TV and we've seen someone whose child has died, and we recognize that look because we can see ourselves in that person's face. You're like, oh, I was there. I feel you. I see you. It is just heart-wrenching. And then it says the invalidation can lead you to develop a mental health condition. Well, yeah, I think most people struggle with some form of anxiety or depression, whether or not it interferes with your life to the extent that you need on medication is debatable. So as grieving people, we have all of these people wanting to invalidate our experiences. And one of the things I want to do with my podcast is to validate people that are receiving these messages from their community, from their family, from society that tells us it's time to get over it. It is just so frustrating. So some of you may not realize what I'm talking about. What am I talking about? But we're taking it one step farther. So validation means that you understand where the other person is coming from, even if you disagree with what they say or do. And as a therapist, that's what I do. Someone comes to me for therapy, and I recognize how they feel and how their thoughts contribute to how they see their world. It's called the worldview. So I try to understand their worldview without making any judgments about that. I listen intently. That's how we do that. Listen intently. I listen for what's not being said. That's very important. And then I don't judge them for what they say. So if someone is trying to quit drinking and they come in and say, man, I had a drink on Saturday night, instead of saying, well, you shouldn't have done that. You know that's not in our therapy plan, yada, yada, yada. And if you have a therapist that does that, leave. You say to them, well, walk me through what was going on Saturday. Let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about your experiences. Let's talk about what we can do better next time. But what you don't do is provide them with criticism, with judgment. That's the other thing I'm trying to do with this podcast, is provide a judgment-free space. Some people, I kept my son's hair. I've heard of people keeping other objects that people are like, oh, that's a little weird. In fact, I saw a meme not that long ago where people were keeping tattoos. I was like, ugh. Christopher had a lot of tattoos, but I can't imagine keeping a piece of his skin. But maybe some people do that. And if that's what they do, then that's okay. Like, if that's what makes them feel better, then let them feel better. So that's what validation means. Where there is no wrong, or however you're handling your grief, it's how you're handling your grief. And we want people to understand that you're going to be sad. So you kind of have to stay in the feelings. I know that's so hard. We're used to drinking it away. We're used to using it away. We're used to social media it away. And to a certain degree, people write it away or use music it away. But you need to sit with it. You need to sit with the emotions of it. And that's what I hope to do for people that are coming on my podcast is come, leave your emotions. We'll walk through it. I really believe that I've even seen this push on social media is on Instagram where we're trying to push people towards healing, and we're not recognizing where they are. Like, where are you? For some people, for me, I stayed in this emotional place, and I believe it's because I was invalidated by the people around me. And as I'm looking at this and some other personal issues we've talked about on the podcast before, but I stayed in the very emotional, invalidated place for a very long time until I started doing this podcast and meeting other people that provided experiences to me that made me realize I wasn't alone. So there is a social theory about being validated. It's called the social verification theory. And so this predicts that in situations of cognitive invalidation, so I would add emotional invalidation too, that people will turn to the group norms to say, is my behavior appropriate? Is it not appropriate? And they even disregard their own ideas about themselves and their beliefs in order to belong to a group, to be socially, they called verified. And so that's what we're doing on Instagram. That's what we're doing with these blogs. And that's what we're doing with having grief life coaches or grief doulas. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful to realize that if we develop a group norm that says we only focus on healing, we're missing part of the point, because we are in turn then invalidating people that are stuck in that place of just pure emotion. And every grieving person, I'm sure, has felt that. So if you're someone like me who used to be very empathic and felt things really deeply, really deeply. See it, and it still happens to a certain degree, that I can feel other people's pain and animals' pain. And it's just like, I felt it so deeply that the pain of losing Chris just like tore me apart. There was a point when I first heard about it that I swear I felt my heart tearing in pieces, because he was dead. It was a physical sensation. And I blacked out. And in that emotional place, if somebody came to me and said, hey, you should focus on healing now, I might have punched them. I have better self-control than that. But I know I would have wanted to, because I'm like, my heart is broken. It is in 1,000 pieces. How can you tell me to heal? There has to be a balance. And those that are saying, here, do this, here, do this, they have good intentions. Like, and even on my podcast, to a certain degree, I say, do this, do that. But I always add the caveat that this worked for me. You have to find your own way. You have to find your path through this. Everybody's is different. And if you don't look inside yourself and you don't look into who you are, you're not going to get where, I shouldn't say you're not going to get where you want to be, but you're going to miss part of the process. And part of the process is pretty important. I cannot emphasize it enough. And I don't even know how I want to say this. I gained some wisdom with Christopher dying. I paid a really high price for it. But I showed up and I did the work. And feeling the emotions, feeling how much it hurts, is part of the process. It absolutely is. So I have people come to me and they're like, well, most of the time when people are using or drinking, it's because they don't want to feel something. I'm like, you can't drink this away. You can't use this away. I do all of the other things that we do to use it away. We just can't do that. You have to go through the emotions first. And having a good therapist that provides you unconditional regard, who walks through those emotions with you, is invaluable. Invaluable. But also seek people out that provide validation for you. People that say, I'm sorry you lost a child. Let me sit with you a while. Let me help you. Because sometimes all we need as grievers is company. Just let me talk. And I think it's harder for my friends because I'm starting to realize there's different kind of processors. There's cognitive processing. I do a lot of that. Like I'm inside my head a lot and I'm thinking a lot. Sometimes to the detriment of people around me because I'm so focused on what's going on inside my head and with my own thought process. But then there's another kind of processing, and that is verbal. And I am a verbal processor too, which means I like to talk it over and over and over and over until I come to a solution. That's just how I do it. And I think that's another reason why I decided to do this podcast, because there's other people out there like me. There's other verbal processors. The cognitive processors are not necessarily the people that are going to listen to a podcast because they're inside their heads. There's other people that are physical processors where they go out hiking and they go out in the woods, and that helps them process their emotions. And so there's different ways also to process these things. And I do primarily the cognitive and the verbal processing. But here lately, I've been doing some emotional processing too, which is just becoming aware of how you feel. And if you don't know how to do that, let me walk you through that. How you acknowledge how you feel. Feel an emotion. At first, I didn't know how to do this. I had never been taught to have emotions. I just had all these feelings, and they were in an ugly bunch inside of me, and I didn't know what to do with them, and they were coming out as anger all of the time. I was like in my 20s. And I started working with a therapist who got me a feeling chart. And so I had 2 little kids at the time I'm doing this. So I put the feeling chart up on the fridge, and then when I was feeling an emotion, I looked at the face and matched it. Looked at the face and matched it. And so I kept doing that. And then I learned to say, where in my body am I feeling this? So here recently, I've been having a lot of trouble in my hips. And I've realized that I carry my stress and my anxiety in my hips. That's my physical body. That's my physical expression of I'm too stressed, I'm too anxious, and this is what I need to do about this. And so it makes me more aware. Where am I feeling anxious? What am I feeling anxious about? And then I have to ask myself if it's in reality. So this happened today. 8 o'clock this morning, my husband's phone rings. It said who it was. It was Modern something. Then it rings again, and then it rings again. Now I'm starting to get anxious. And I ask him, well, answer the phone. He's like, I don't want to answer the phone. Well, answer the phone. And then afterwards, I had to explain to him that when it rings many times like that, I'm like, what if it's my son? What if he's somewhere and he doesn't have his phone and he's using someone else's phone and you're not answering the phone? And what if he's trying to get hold of you? And what if he is in a bad accident and they're calling to tell us he was in a bad accident? What if this happened? And what if this happened? And what if there's something wrong with him and you're not taking the calls and it just goes round and round, round and round? That's never going away. You can give me all the anxiety medication in the world, all of it. But because my son died, there is no simple phone call. None. I will be always waiting for the next phone call. And that is the piece that people just don't understand. But if I hadn't done the work to understand myself and understand how Christopher's death has impacted my emotions, so I can make that connection between my emotions and my anxiety. And I refuse to call it depression. I'm grieving. When I am sad about Christopher, I am grieving. It is not depression. There's no cognitive elements to that. What am I going to tell myself? Let's see. I refuse to say he's in a better place because he's not. He didn't get to experience life, and he should have been allowed to experience life. And that's not fair. And it's so not fair. And then there's the spiritual people say, that's his path. You know, I don't care if it was his path. It just frustrates me beyond the belief is when I say something to somebody and they respond to me in a cliche way. No, that's invalidating. Now, if I myself come to this conclusion, and I have friends that come to this conclusion and it's very helpful for them, but they got there by themselves. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. Each person has to get to where they need to be on their own. Not because you told them that's what the social norm was. Because it may not be their social norm. And in order to be validated or be part of that group of grieving mothers, they may accept that. And we have to be careful of that. We have to be all-inclusive and add everyone that might be on the fringes or the outsides. We need to make this a community where we all feel validated. So I want to end this podcast with some tips that you can do about helping people feel validated in their grief. Just sit with them. Just their presence. I had somebody just hug me after they found out Christopher died. That's it, just hug me. Listen to me. Listen to them. Don't start talking about yourself, how you lost your dog and how you lost your grandparents. It is not the same. Just listen. And when they say you're sad, say, I'm sorry you're sad. I see that you're sad. I acknowledge that you're sad. Pay attention. Don't get on the phone. Just pay attention to them. I don't think people realize how much your presence, just who you are, helps people. Just showing up. And sometimes not speaking is probably the best option, especially if you don't know what to say. Just be present. Don't fall back on cliches. Don't fall back on religion, because you don't know where that person is with that right then. Let them find their way. Be a partner along the way. Don't tell them what to do. Say, well, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that. Don't do that. Just be there. Just show up. And you may get tired of it. And it may make you uncomfortable, but it is your responsibility as the person showing up to manage your own emotions. It is not the responsibility of the griever to manage those for you. And when you invalidate our grief, that is what you are doing. And I think people need to know that and understand that. So that's the end of our topic about validation today and why it's important in grief. Thank you for listening. You can follow me over on Instagram. I have not been very active over there. I hope to start getting more active. It's been a pretty rough summer. As far as work goes, I've been pretty busy. I'm on Facebook, haven't been very active over there. I hope to get some merchandise together. I'm going on vacation here soon, and I'm just going to spending some time working on the podcast, doing some other different things. So thank you for listening.